why did you, or if you're a character from a story, why did you pick Hermione Granger as your spirit animal, your Patronus?
I know. Yeah. So my husband and I recently like watched all the Harry Potters. I had watched them when I was a lot younger,
Hmm.
so it was fresh in my mind when I was filling out those questions that you provided. Um, and when I was watching the movies, her character, she's very much like, bookish. She's very smart. She's good at kind of thinking up solutions. And I kind of saw myself in her character in that sense. And she's very
Hmm.
devoted and loyal to her friends, right? Ron and Harry. And I'm kind of
Hmm.
that way too. Like, I have some very close friends that I've known my whole life. And yeah, and she's very, she's doesn't like when people are all goofing off and super, joking. And she's just very serious. And that's kind of how I've typically am. And so I just saw myself in her character a lot.
Well, there you
So
go,
that's why I
everybody.
picked
Welcome. We're chatting with Hermione Granger today, and I think
her.
that's awesome. She's got a novel coming out in September called The Divided Kingdom.
Yeah.
So, welcome, Allison Ramirez, to the Catholic Author Show. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. So, our little intro, this is Catholic Author, the show. It's about fiction for modern Catholic authors. We'll talk creed, craft, and co creation. It's rooted in grit, grace, gods, and occasionally we'll talk about dragons. I'm your host, Dominic DeSouza, novel lover, all round creative, founder of Catholic Author. We're here to inspire your faith and your fiction. Allison is a Catholic author. She's an editor, content creator, and a teacher. We're going to chat about her upcoming novel, The Divided Kingdom. So, first, Allison, before getting into your story, what is your origin story? What's your backstory that led to who you are today?
Right. Yeah. Well, growing up, as I'm sure many of us writers are, I loved storytelling. I loved reading books. I would just kind of write my own ideas that came to mind. And then, of course, as I got older and I went off to college, I got more serious about writing and I majored in English, creative writing specifically. And I had been writing off and on, like I'd written a couple novels, more informally in high school. And then actually my Divided Kingdom book is based on the novel I wrote when I was in high school. And so I let it
Awesome.
sit for like 4 years and I'm revisiting it and changing a lot of it. So this has been a story that's been in the works for a while. But I graduated with that English degree. And then I've actually been working in the church since then. So I started off in the Archdiocese of Seattle working in the benefits department. And then most recently, I'm the faith formation minister at my local parish.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I do is like my day job. But my dream is to be able to write more full time and edit. And so I do freelance editing on the side. I also do some teaching on the side too for elementary kids for English. But my
Mm-hmm.
real passion is in writing. And so this is my first fiction book. I self published a nonfiction book back in October of last year on the Rosary.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is my first time actually trying to get a fiction book completed and edited and published. And so that is a very condensed version, I guess, of my backstory.
No, that's really cool. So you freelance in editing as
Hmm.
well,
Yes.
and what was you mentioned that this book was something you'd written earlier, and then you picked it up again and revised it. Can you go back to that? What was that like for you when you were younger? You said in high school.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
what was that
it all
experience or
started with an
process?
idea. And so I wanted to write about a character that was invisible and that the only person that could see them was one of the other characters in the book. So this character was invisible to everyone else except for their other, I guess, co-protagonist. And
Okay.
so that was where the idea began. And I wrote it to completion. It was almost 100,000 words. And I was like,
Oh
I'm going to get
wow.
this published. This is going to be great. But that was back,
Uh-huh.
like 17, 18. I didn't know really anything about the publishing world, traditional or self-publishing. And
Mm-hmm.
so it got written, and then I was proud of that, but I didn't really pursue like editing it and looking to publish it until more recently in the past 6 months. I participated in NaNoWriMo back in November,
Nice.
and I used that manuscript. And so I pretty much started from scratch, actually. I really didn't like take that manuscript and work with it. It was more like I used the ideas and I wrote kind of a completely different story, but I kept those same two protagonists. But pretty much everything
Wow.
else was different. So
What was it? Can I ask what the word count ended up being for that
um
NaNoWriMo?
for NaNoWriMo, I ended at 60,000 words. And that was
That's
starting
still just
completely from
impressive.
scratch. So even though I
Yeah.
had that 100,000 word manuscript, I started from the beginning, just using those same two characters. And now it's at, I'm hoping to finish it over the weekend, and it's at 107,000 words right now.
Fantastic. Did it feel like writing a sequel or kind of going back home, or what did it feel like to do that?
It did. It was really neat because I felt like these characters had matured and I had matured with them, and they were kind of going on a new journey, I guess. That was more, I don't know. The first version was very much, it was supposed to be based on Earth, but they were kind of in this alternate realm, and some of my beta readers were just kind of confused on that. And so this time around, it's very much, it's a dystopian novel. And so it's kind of Earth, but like, got 50, 60 years in the future. And so I think that was it was easier to write it that way than trying to kind of come up with this kind of alternate world because it's on Earth. And so that was, that was easier for me to write kind of a cohesive story that made sense that way. But it's based on, so very loosely based on the divided kingdom in the Bible, that section in the Old Testament where you have the 12 tribes and they get separated into the 10 tribes and then the 2 other tribes. So it's kind of based on that, but a modern, I guess, retelling of it. So
Ooh, intriguing. And yeah, you mentioned before we started chatting that you haven't yet really shared a blurb and you're still working on the revisions, but it is getting published by September. So you had agreed kindly to share a sneak preview of what the blurb might be like. So you've already started sharing that. It's based on that, or it's taking inspiration from the divided kingdom of Israel, but you've transposed it into the future, into a dystopian future. So where does the book go? Like, who are the main characters? And then what's that first, 30% of where the story's going?
Right. Well, so it starts with 50 years in the past, so more of our modern day, like kind of 2020 type year. And it's on an island. So it actually starts on what's called the mainland. And so that isn't an island, but there's people living there and they're Catholics and they're modern day Catholics. But then people from kind of outside come in and start invading and taking over. And so they're forced to flee. And so they flee. There's 2 different groups, and that's where the divided kingdom comes in. So half of them go to one island and then half of them go to another island. And the idea is that the one island kind of maintains the Catholic tradition and the Catholic faith versus the other island, they lose their sense of faith. And it kind of becomes this dystopian world where it's all about efficiency and progress. And there's a lot of, I kind of weave in some modern day science, into that. That's kind of more I guess using is this moral and morality, some different things that they're trying to have going on in their society. And so it's, the 2 different islands, keeps the faith and then the other one doesn't. And so the 2 main characters are on the island that doesn't keep to the faith. And so it's them kind of they were told that they're the only island, they're the only remnant of their people that had survived from that initial invasion. And they don't even know that this other island exists with some of their other, I guess, ancestors that had left that mainland.
Okay.
And so they're figuring that out, that this other island exists, and then they're kind of traveling to it, and then there's kind of some war between the 2 islands that breaks out. And then the 2 main characters, again, it's one of them is invisible, and then one of them isn't. And then there's some backstory about the invisible character, and he actually ends up being, he ends up having been killed previously, and so he doesn't really realize that at first, and then so it's kind of, it was meant to be a little bit of purgatory kind of too, this idea of kind of him, he still kind of exists in the real world, but he hasn't made that final, I guess, transition over to heaven.
That's okay. My first thought was I see dead people, and now it's actually kind of appropriate. Oh, that's cool. That's really fun, actually. I love it when people can dramatize that stage of just beginning to enter the afterlife, and that's intriguing. Okay, was this the same kind of story that you had written before, or this is almost a completely different, even world?
Before, in the first version, I had it where it was that same idea where he had been killed and he was kind of trying to figure out where he was at and still on Earth, but also kind of making that way to heaven. So that element was still there, but the idea of the 2 islands, and that the war on that mainland that caused them to leave, that was all not in the first book at all.
Okay.
And so that was all. I guess I really kind of expanded the plot more. It was more just about those two characters, and then now I have a lot of other, like I have friends that they're also working with, and I have some older characters that still remember life on the mainland before they went off to the islands. So I just introduced a lot more characters and a lot more subplots than I had in that first version of the book.
That is cool. That's cool. What's the age range? Is there a target range that you wrote it for?
Well, I'm thinking maybe kind of young adults. The main characters are like in their early 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably maybe like a young adult kind of feel to the book.
That's really cool. When you're writing this story, is it more of an event-based story? Like, oh, this would be a really cool situation to explore? Or do you start with the characters and like, I really like these characters and let's see where they go and let's build a situation out of who they are, where they need to be? Or is it a mixture of both?
I think I really get attached to characters. I kind of have a character idea that I really like, and I think I kind of base the world around those characters and their individual journeys. Because it's kind of one of the main, I guess, threads is that the character that is able to see the character that can't be seen, she feels invisible by those around her, which is the irony is that she's able to see someone that is actually invisible. And so it's her trying to kind of find her sense of belonging with those around her in her community, and then ultimately in her faith as well, because she's from that island that has lost the sense of faith. And so they kind of erect this new sense, like they do believe in like a higher power, but the higher power they believe in is more of like that controlling and not a loving higher power. And so that's the way that the leaders kind of enforce their control over the citizens on the island, is this idea of, there's all these laws and rules and this higher power, like if you break one of these rules, like it's going to be detrimental to you. And so the idea of a loving God doesn't exist on the island. And so it's kind of her journey of coming to know of a loving God and feeling like she's seen and that she belongs, and then helping that invisible character, I guess, make that transition to heaven, I guess, throughout the story in a way.
Well, let's not get too clear on that because that's kind of the magic of the book.
Right.
One thing one of the reasons why I resonate with this is because I did pretty much the same thing as you did. I wrote a novel when I was a kid, and then it just got buried, and I didn't do anything with it until I was, I don't know, mid-20s. And then I re-edited it and published it, and I still want to go back and rewrite it now, but it's out there, just let it alone. But one thing I noticed, and I'm curious where you go with this, what you think. As you go back and you read stories of things that you wrote like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and you start to get a sense of who you were back then and why you gravitated to certain choices and so on, and certain things like intrigued you. And I'm curious if any sort of self-revelations or just revelations about growing up came to you as you were taking these characters out of that younger context and then working with them in a newer one. Anything jump out at you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I see that in the sense of, as I mentioned before, they were just kind of focused on their lives and their problems, which I think was how I was. When you're younger, you kind of think the world revolves around you, and then you grow up and you realize, oh gosh, it's so much more and bigger than that. And so in this new version, it's about these two characters, but I actually write it in the first person, and so each chapter has a different character focus, like from their perspective. Okay. And so they're not the only two characters that I give a first-person perspective to. Like, there's, I think, 2 other characters that the chapters alternate between the 4 of them. And so I think that sense of realizing that the world is bigger and there's so many other subplots with other characters that are intertwined in the story. So it's not only about those 2 characters anymore. It's about a lot of the other characters, too, and their unique struggles and their unique challenges, which I think is a reflection of me growing up and realizing that and wanting to explore, because I think I saw myself a lot in some of those those 2 main characters, and now I'm interweaving other characters that I wouldn't normally have, I guess, cared about, maybe what they were struggling with, and now I'm
you've moved beyond the interest in just those 2, and
exactly.
So in creating the characters, what was some of the hardest things that you, I don't know, struggled with in actually making them feel believable to you and then maybe to your beta readers, or in the re-editing process? What was one of the hardest things you struggled with and maybe overcame?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is with that invisible character, because it was really hard to write it, and when you're having those scenes where the character that is able to see that character is talking to another character, so having them talk without, I guess, like that character can only be seen by one person, so sometimes there were times when it'd be like confusing to show that, I guess, in my writing, if that makes sense. That sense of them, and also they're not able to like touch a lot of things because they're invisible, and so like they couldn't pick things up, and so there'd be a time where I want to write about that, and I'd be like, oh wait, I can't do that because that's going to kind of break the wall of like this character's abilities. So that was tricky, and I guess writing in the sense of someone that is dead, and about their processing that was also was challenging, trying to put myself in that mentality as a writer.
That's intriguing. Is there a tip that you ended up settling on that you'd be open to sharing about like how to think of somebody who it has passed on but is still alive and interacting with things?
Yeah. Well, one way I did that is, as I mentioned, I was very loosely, I'll say that, writing kind of in the sense of purgatory. And so the Catholic teaching of purgatory is that, you're in this kind of, it's not necessarily a physical place, but you've died in a state of grace, but you're still needing to be cleansed of things in your life before you are able to go into heaven. And so I wrote that as this character they're dead, but they have something that they had not fully let go in their life. And so they died like they're, believing in God in that state of grace, but they're still holding on to some of those earthly attachments. And so this character is working through those within the book. And that's kind of what's ultimately stopping them from, I guess, going up into heaven. And
that's cool. Well, hey, if you're having fun enjoying this conversation right now, please go ahead, hit like so that more people can hear about Allison, hear about her work, and learn more about Divided Kingdom when it does come out later on. So let's take a step away from the book for a minute. I want to ask you a little more personally, was there a story that you really enjoyed reading growing up? Perhaps a legend or I don't know, it was a movie or something that you like to come back to and chew on that just means a lot to you, and maybe it ended up informing or it's kind of inspiring some of this story.
Yeah, what immediately comes to mind, and a lot of people have never heard of this series, so I'll be curious if you've heard of it, but it's called the Skullduggery Pleasant series, and it's by an Irish author, and it's an 8-book series, and it's not written from any faith background at all, but the main premise is that there's a skeleton detective, and he's solving mysteries and crimes, and then he has his sidekick is a human, like a girl that's like in her early. She ages throughout the book. I think she starts as like 15 and then she ends like maybe like 25. But it's their adventures that they go on. And there's like magic and spells and sorcery and a whole lot of like kind of like Harry Potter-esque themes within it. But it really goes with those two characters. And actually, now that I'm talking about it, I guess in a way that kind of maybe informed my current story, because it has the one who's dead, the skeleton detective, and then a human girl, and they're working together. And my story is about a character that's also dead, and then a human girl is actually, they're both human, but the human girl is the one that's helping the character that has passed on. So
that's fun.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, I really liked it. The writing it's very funny. Like, it's very humorous. Like, he throws a lot of like jokes and funny things into like the otherwise kind of like stressful plot of like solving crime and mysteries and murder and all that. So yeah, and it was cool because when I was reading that series, it was in the process of still being written, and so I'd read the next book and I'd have to wait a year for the next one to come out. So I kind of grew up, I guess, with the story.
Oh, that's fun.
Which was pretty neat. So, because I think I started reading when it was like only the second book was out, and by the end there was like 8 books, and it was like every year one was released. So
that is so cool. That's cool. So speaking along those lines, well, I guess let me ask the one question: is there? Are you considering a sequel to Divided Kingdom, or it's very much a standalone? It's its own novel, and you'll think about other things afterwards?
I am actually thinking of a sequel.
Cool.
And kind of my main idea was, as I said, they, at the beginning, they have to leave their mainland and go to these 2 islands. And so the sequel, I want them to return to that mainland, kind of, which is similar to how in the Bible, when they're divided, then they end up returning, right, to the promised land. Yeah. So that's my very loose idea, is I'd like to see them go back there. Because again, that was kind of where they had the heart of their faith and their worship, and then they had to get, taken out of that place. So that was kind of my idea for a sequel.
Well, that's cool. I've got two questions that come to mind. I want to ask you them in a second. One is world building, how you handle that, and and then second, the particular kind of Catholicity or Catholicism that is part of your culture, since it's an overt part of the story. So I want to ask you about that in a second. First, this interview, it's a preview, or it's an insight into the kind of community that we're building in Catholic Author. It's a super friendly, creative community for the modern Catholic fiction writer. It's a place to give and get feedback, share insights, works in progress, build a network of supportive friends, and plus there's a whole lot more always going on. Come and check us out. Join us at CatholicAuthor.us. So, Allison, well, first let's talk about the sort of kind of, what is the Catholic culture that you work with? Because, you travel around the world and there's like African Catholicism and there's Chinese Catholicism, and then there's like different areas in Greece have their own sort of culture and their own kind of flavor. What's the culture that you're working with in yours?
Right. Well, I am in the United States on the West Coast in Washington. And I think the kind of Catholic culture I'm dealing with is very much, a lot of people have left the faith. I know people talk about the West Coast is pretty liberal. And so there's a lot of liberal, I guess, views out there. And I have more of a kind of a conservative view. And so, but I'm working with a lot of people that are trying to return to the faith and kind of integrate the faith into their life. Because there's been a lot of, I guess, secular influences in kind of that West Coast area. And I'm working at the parish level. So I'm working at a small kind of country parish with a small community. But yeah, I guess I would just, I guess that's a little bit about my
North American question. But. Yeah. No, that's cool. So I'm curious then, as you're, given how you work and where you work, and kind of, this is kind of why this is a fun conversation about being Catholic and then writing fiction. Is the story more, does it feel to you like more of a parable, or it actually is like its own story, but it's kind of written by somebody who's Catholic, and so that's part of it, but it's really more about a cool story, or is it about sharing a serious message? How did you approach that?
I think it's a little bit of both. Because I know there's a lot of people talk about preachy fiction, right? Where it just kind of feels like you're just throwing like Bible verses out or this or that, and there really isn't a whole lot of story. And so I don't want to fall into that. Like, I really want to write a compelling story that has its own, standalone appeal outside of just being a faith story. But definitely, I mean, you really couldn't read the story without seeing that there's faith elements in it, for sure. Yeah. But I'm trying to write it very much with both in mind. And I think a cool thing about these characters is that a lot of them are dealing with some really big issues, I guess, a lot of big problems in their life, and it's not necessarily that they're resolved perfectly or completely, which I like to have that in my writing, because that's kind of how it is in real life. Like, even if you're someone of faith, like, you're going to have struggles, you're going to have doubts, and so I like to reflect that in my characters and not just have everything, like, get wrapped up in a nice bow and work out perfectly. But I like to say, like, I want people to feel that there is a good God working within a broken characters in a broken world. So showing those themes, but also having faith as a part of it too.
And I think that's perfect. I mean, that's exactly what Catholic Author is all about. That's why we've got this show, and it's part of our outlook on how to encourage people to write fiction is, don't be pushy, don't be preachy, but let's actually make interesting characters and actually have interesting situations. And it's, we're writers, it's got to be about a good story. It's like if you're making a Catholic car, I don't even know what that would be like, but it's got to be an excellent car. I don't care if there's crucifixes welded into the mainframe.
Right.
Does it do what it's supposed to do, which is captivate it? Well, if you're telling a story, you don't want a car to captivate your attention for an hour, but with a story you want to kind of forget about everything else for a while and just get sucked into the story. Is there an antagonist in the character, or is it more the sort of negative thing that they're battling with is perhaps themselves, or the environment, the situation, or there's a couple of different, antagonists, or is there one main one? How did you handle that?
Yeah, well, there's two actually that come to mind. One of them is the leader of that one island that didn't keep to the faith. So they're just kind of enforcing that very much like rule following, like god of like thunder, idea.
Yeah.
And that main leader is knows about the other island and doesn't want those characters to know that there's another way of viewing one's faith that exists. And then the other antagonist is actually a character that is at the heart of who this character is. They are a good character, but they have made a really big decision that really impacted a lot of the other characters in a negative way. And so they're kind of dealing with that regret. And so a lot of the characters view them as an antagonist, but I see this more of they're good at heart, but they just made this really big mistake that is kind of haunting them to present day. I don't want to go too much into it, but that's kind of the gist of it. So,
Oh, that's really cool. So if you don't mind, I want to ask you about world building then. As how you're developing the kind of world, and especially since you plan to go back into it, I imagine that means you're spending time thinking about, the location and like you said, it's a dystopian sort of setup in the future. Mm-hmm. How do you develop that kind of world? Do you sort of imagine a world that you've seen in a couple of movies you really enjoyed, or what kind of research do you do for that sort of thing?
I know.
How do you make it feel real?
Well, actually, so the idea of the islands was actually taken from a trip that my mom and I went to. We went to Ireland a couple years ago.
Oh, cool.
And so I'm kind of writing the world like on some of those landscapes that I saw in Ireland, kind of the green rolling hills and then the coastlines. And so that, I guess, in terms of the landscape has really been influencing how the world looks. And I guess one of the islands is very much, they have gone back to a very simple way of living. There's not really a whole lot of, even though it's in the future, there's not really technology. It's much more, like almost like a simplistic way of life, versus the other island is more like with the new technologies and medical advances. Okay. And so, I definitely had to kind of put a different thinking cap on when I write those two worlds, because, it's very different in that sense.
Do you mind if I ask? I'm curious why you ended up, and I might agree with it, but I'm curious what your line of thinking was, why you ended up making that decision to kind of sort of separate off technology onto the one, and then the more maybe rural or holistic or, grounded, and one being better or healthier, more whole than the other. I was curious why that division was made. Not that it was good or wrong.
Yeah.
Just working through that.
I guess I've always kind of been one that has been more of the simple mentality. Like, it's been hard for me to get on social media and Instagram. Like, growing up, I just kind of like to just be like writing on paper and had my few close friends. And it's only been recently that I've really been embracing technology as a way to, I guess, evangelize, a way to make connections with people. And so that island that's based on that more simplistic way of life is, I guess, what kind of more comes naturally to me. And then I kind of made it to the extreme on the one end. And I think ultimately the book's going to kind of settle somewhere in the middle, where they kind of realize, like, it's technology is good, and, medical advances can be good, but there's value in that simple way as well. And so I think that's where the kind of characters will ultimately land. But I was also always very overwhelmed by like technology and everything that was happening, and then now I'm kind of seeing the value in both.
I like that a lot. Like you said, the better or the right answer is finding a way to integrate both and not run away from like one extreme to the other. But there is that value in both. I think that's cool. Well, how can people get in touch with you if they want to hear more about the announcement of the book, or check out your Rosary journal that you self-published, and then your blog, or maybe get in touch with you for some freelance editing? How can they reach you?
Right. Well, the main place to reach me is on my website, which is author.AllisonRamirez.com. And I've got a newsletter that people can subscribe to. I've got tabs on there with my current book and then my work in progress. And then I'm also on YouTube as well, at Allison Ramirez. I took a break from it most recently because I wanted to devote more time to this current work in progress. But before that, I was trying to post like weekly or bi-weekly videos on kind of Catholic fiction themes. That's Allison Ramirez on YouTube. And then I'm on Instagram as well at author Allison Ramirez. So, but my website has like links to all that. So if you go to my website, you'll find everything there.
Cool. I will drop that in the show notes. And now, wrapping up our conversation here today. It's always my favorite part. If you had 1 minute to share a message of encouragement to other Catholic, fiction writers, what would you want to share with them?
Yeah, I guess my number one advice would be to not be afraid of community and to really embrace that. I know when I self-published my first book, I had a couple beta readers, but I didn't have like a critique group. I didn't have a whole lot of social media presence, but now I'm realizing the value of having community. Like being a Catholic fiction writer is a small niche, but there is a lot of us out there, and I think we're starting to grow. And so getting in touch with other writers and not being afraid to share your work, either in a critique group or in a forum, and be open to that feedback. And I guess building relationships and supporting and encouraging one another as fellow writers would be my feedback. Because I think a lot of us are just solitary writing our books, and then we kind of miss out on that community element and what we can learn from one another. And I've only been scratching the surface with that in these past couple months, but it's already been really positively impacting my life as a writer and making friends and building writer community.
That's fantastic. I think it's a great place to end. Thanks, Allison, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic, for having me.
And for all those who are watching, till next time, keep writing.